let's talk to Mark. Mark's calling from Pennsylvania, and he has a question about religion getting a pass about speaking to people who aren't there. I'm not sure what we mean by that. Mark, thanks for calling in. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Hi.
Hello?
Yeah, what do you got for us today?
Yeah.
All right, so the gentleman that called earlier God, as it were, and I was expecting a lot more from God if he actually existed, but it doesn't. And his constant use of the word faith and belief, and somehow that can justify anything you want to believe. And that your faith, outweighs my facts when it doesn't. And I'm a pretty much number 10 atheist. And it just seems that, like in any other circumstance, if someone were talking in a room to somebody who wasn't there, it would be called a psychosis or some type of mental illness, people who are constantly speaking to someone who's not there. And again, I'm not a doctor, but it just seems like religion gets there is no one, they're speaking to no one, and yet it's not like called out for what it is. You have no evidence. It's the denial of reality. It is a completely, made up story. And there seems to be on the ACA a little bit of hesitance to call out these people. It's like, well, you're talking to no one. And when you hear him answer, it's always in your own voice. And that I feel like, religious people might qualify for having something of a mental illness, but you can't do it because too much of the world are believers.
So that's part of the thing, but I mean, I alluded to this previously on some shows, but for something to be a mental illness, it's not enough to have the symptoms, right? It also has to be causing distress. And so for some people who are religious and who talk to God, it is distressing, right? So we get people who come in through the Emerge who are properly psychotic, right? Like as in they are experiencing psychosis, and they may believe that they are Jesus, or they are God, or they're talking to God, or they're possessed by God, or maybe they're just some sort of prophet or something like that. And those people are in distress. And the fact that they are talking to God and potentially hearing things that God's saying is a symptom that helps you categorize them as having a mental illness, right? But the key is that it's causing distress. The thing is, for the vast majority of religious people, they're, 1/2-way conversations with God are not causing them distress, as you alluded to, potentially because they're living in a society where that's normalized, right? But I mean, this is the way that we categorize mental illness, is it has to be causing some sort of problem in the patient's life for it to be properly called a mental illness.
Not to cut you off, but I did read a certain amount online, and everyone says this, like I have an idea and I Google it, that it seems to be like hurting people or being violent seems to be the metric by which, doing harm is what psychosis is about. But if all
most people with mental illness are not violent. Most people with psychosis are non-violent.
There seems to be like, are they hurting anyone? And it's like, well, no, it's just their way of getting through life.
No, so that's not a diagnostic criteria, right? Hurting someone is not a diagnostic criteria for diagnosing a mental illness or psychosis specifically. You can be psychotic, for you can be psychotic and never hurt a fly, right?
True.
Right.
They are still talking to someone who's not there. And there's a whole group of people who vote based on like the sayings of these preachers, who are of a being who doesn't exist. So, when they pass laws that, maybe take away voting rights or a woman's right to choose because of their discussion with someone who's not there, it seems like they still are committing violence against people.
So are you eager to, I won't say eager, do you want to identify this religious behavior as mental illness to invalidate those opinions? Or to call attention to the invalidity or the nonsensical aspect of those those beliefs? Or what do you think?
Well, my first thing is, of course, that they're talking to someone who's not there. But
Right.
I can't not observe that this does seem to, motivate people to, become part of the political process, which eventually causes people to lose, a certain amount of their rights or their dignity.
Sure. But why do you want to label them with a diagnosis of psychosis?
Why the correlation? Why connect those two things?
Yeah.
Because
I think
if I was in a room with someone or people and I was talking to someone and they're like, "Who are you talking to?"
Mm-hmm.
People would say you were crazy. And so
yeah, but those people are not psychiatrists.
Literally,
yeah, and I can kind of see I can see kind of where you're coming from in a way. Like there are some things that we could describe as being similar to it, because you're drawing on maybe one or two symptoms of something that we know to be a part of the whole the full diagnostic criteria for different mental illnesses. I think that it's important to be very wary of calling religious people, or you're trying to even connect the two things. I think one, that it's going to cause more defensiveness and things coming from people who maybe you are trying to have conversations with, by trying to say that they have a mental illness when that's not part of the diagnostic criterion. Having religious faith is not anywhere, has never been in the DSM-5 and all these things that we know about the mental illnesses that we study. The other thing is that I think it's we need to be careful that we're not harming people who do have diagnosed mental illnesses or who are struggling with that, because you did make the connection that psychosis could equal harming people, and MD Aware pointed out that that's not always the case. So I think it's really good to have a good understanding of what language you're using to describe something. I think that you're making a good point in the fact that you see harm happening. I think that's the bigger point you're making here, is that you see harm happening from people who have certain types of religious beliefs. And I agree with you. That's why we're doing the show in a lot of ways. We see that people make their decisions based on their religious beliefs and things that I would hard disagree on, and they're making their decisions with the way that they're voting and all of these things. But I don't think that it's fair to see the harm, the valid harm, and then link that to mental illness, because I think it just kind of does an injustice for everybody in the whole conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I've just two things to add, Erin, but you summarize that nicely. Remember, Mark, that just because, in the same way that someone doesn't necessarily have major depressive disorder if they're feeling sad, right? That sadness is one of the criteria for major depressive disorder. Just because they meet one criteria, it doesn't mean they have the disease. So in the same way, you don't have psychosis just because you meet one of the criteria of talking to someone who isn't there, responding to internal stimuli, that sort of thing. And the second is that you have to remember that diagnoses, mental health diagnoses, and all diagnoses exist to serve patients, right? They exist to guide people on how to basically treat patients with disease. If the patient's not being harmed, if the patient is not in any distress, you don't make a diagnosis of the mental illness. And so you simply can't use the mental illness diagnosis as an excuse to invalidate or attack those people. You can attack their ideas. You can attack the fact that you think they're talking to no one, but you can do that without invoking, a mental health
And you could
diagnosis.
and you can bring up the fact that you see harm and kind of stick to that point, because I think that like those are the things, if I'm reading this, your point properly here, like that's what you're upset about, is that you see that it's causing, that you see the harm that it's causing. So like sticking to that too, and not getting these other words and these these other labels kind of mixed into it. Does that sound okay,
Well,
Mark? I see where you're coming from.
That it's like if we're all atheists here, the idea that people gather, every Sunday or, Friday night or whenever, that, there seems to be a carve out for religious people, but they're all gathering and singing and dancing and speaking, and they're all about this person who's not there. And that's an observation that needs to be taken into consideration.
And I think it is. I think it is being taken into consideration. I think that we observe that as well. And I mean, there's nothing about gathering or singing or any of the other parts that you mentioned that are strictly religious. I think that's human behavior in a lot of ways. But the other parts that you mentioned, that speaking to somebody who's not there, we do notice. We are taking notice of it.
The question is, what do you want us to do about that, Mark? Are you suggesting that the people who have those beliefs should be restricted from doing certain things?
No, I guess just in the context of the shows that I watch on, the Atheist Experience and such, that sometimes we don't call them out. It's just like, as much as we should, that it's like, you have no evidence of anything. Who are you talking to? I
mean, we try to do that literally every call.
There's a balance here, right? Like we want to have a conversation. I think ultimately our goal isn't to just go like, maybe at least that's not our goal here. We want to have conversations with people. We want to hear why, like how they've got to their belief and kind of talk with them through it. So I know the first caller was, talking about, he's claiming his God. Of course, we understand that he was making a bit of a joke on it. It doesn't mean that we can't have a conversation and kind of play into it for a little bit for the purposes of having a conversation. So there's a balance though, because you don't want to push everybody away. Sometimes you just got to
meet people where they are and try to work with them, right? Because otherwise, every conversation would go the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's different formats for it too.
I just wanted to call and say what my truth was and see how you guys felt with it, because I know that everybody on these programs, thinks deeply about these issues, and I wanted no more than just to have this brief conversation.
Yeah,
and I appreciate both of your opinions.
That's great. I really appreciate you calling in, and I think that your frustrations are valid, and I think it's a good conversation. I think that everybody made some good points here. So
yeah, I mean, thank you for calling in. We agree with you, Mark. Right? We agree that like they're not really talking to anyone. So I mean, we're with you on that. It's just a question of
how to proceed.
Yeah, exactly. How to proceed.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna let you go, Mark. Yeah, thanks for calling in. You too. Yeah, I mean, I totally get the frustration there, right? And I think that in certain formats, sorry, I'm just going to talk about it for one more second. I think that in different formats, you can have that option. If you're frustrated, go on Reddit. You can call somebody whatever you want on Reddit. That's not what we've chosen to do here. I think that you do see that kind of, that kind of interaction all the time on the internet. And so, I think we've kind of come to an agreement here at the Atheist Community of Austin, or Truth Wanted specifically. We want to have conversations with people and give them, have some goodwill towards the people who call in, and not immediately put somebody on the back foot when it comes to a conversation. So yeah.
And I mean, I get where Mark's coming from, and I sort of see it as well. I've seen other hosts on different ACA shows really have a strong reaction to the comparison between belief and the like rituals around belief and mental illness. And I think that, you know, it's not a totally random connection, you know, because there is an overlap in the behavior of believers and, you know, the symptoms of certain forms of psychosis, which is reflected in the DSM. But, you know, just because, you know, one or two of the symptoms are aligned doesn't mean that the whole diagnosis is aligned.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think I get where he's coming from. But we just got to be really careful about diagnosing people with mental illnesses when we are not a psychiatrist and they're not our patient.
Yeah, exactly.